Okay, class, welcome to Unit 7 Learning. This is the second video. It is the part 1 for classical conditioning. There will be an additional part 2 continuing the rest of your notes. This covers pages 215 to 222 in your textbook. So let's begin. The basic definition of learning. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior due to an experience. So there's an actual change in your behavior. This unit, we've already talked about observational learning, where you've changed your behavior, but it's also going to contain classical conditioning and operant conditioning. This video specifically looks at classical conditioning. Okay, oftentimes we learn through associations where you're beginning to pair two things together. Association is learning that certain events occur together at the same time. We learn to associate behaviors in given contexts. For example, oftentimes popcorn and movies are paired together. Another example of something that's paired together is a doctor's office, maybe with pain. Conditioning is the process of learning using association, so oftentimes you're conditioned to behave in certain ways. Two types of associations we will look at is classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning associates two stimuli and thus to anticipate certain events. For example, the two things that are paired together is a flash of light and a crack of thunder. So when lightning flashes nearby, you can begin to brace yourself to react a certain way. So the two things that are often paired together is the crack, okay, and the flash. And then how you're going to all of a sudden respond is you're going to become kind of anxious that something's going to happen. Operant conditioning associates a response, our behaviors, and its consequences. So operant conditioning works on a lot of the times if you get a consequence, you may be able to act a certain way. And thus repeated acts followed by good results and avoids acts followed by bad results. So if you're given a piece of candy, you're more prone to behave a certain way. You miss a homework assignment and you may be more prone to get a bad grade. First one we're going to look at in this video is classical conditioning. The person that is responsible for classical conditioning is Ivan Pavlov. He was born in 1849 and died in 1939. He is known for his famous classical conditioning experiment. He's one of the most famous psychologists in history. He laid the framework for early psychologists such as John B. Watson. He was oftentimes driven by research. He set aside his initial plan to follow his father to become a Russian Orthodox priest. He first explored and received his medical degree at the age of 33. For the next 2 decades, he studied the digestion system. He received a Nobel Peace Prize in his early research in 1904 on digestion. However, he became a new direction was explored when he became across an incidental discovery which led him to explore classical conditioning. He was studying digestion in dogs, and he found out that dogs would salivate naturally with food. If I were to put a cheeseburger in front of you, you'd begin to salivate. But what he thought was an annoyance was a basic discovery. The dogs began salivating before they were given the food. They saw Pavlov walk in and they would start salivating. They saw certain lights turn on and they would start salivating. They'd see a specific tray and it would start them to begin to salivate. He explored all these neutral elements to see if the dogs would salivate: bowls, bells, trays, etc. Once the association was made, the dogs would begin to salivate. The dogs begin to pair the food with all these neutral elements, which would cause one to begin to salivate. Hence, discovering classical conditioning. Dogs must have learned and become conditioned to salivate because of these other things. So what is classical conditioning? You might want to jot down this diagram for your notes. Okay, so before conditioning, before any learning takes place, you have the food, which is the unconditioned stimulus. Okay, it causes an unconditioned response, which is something that's natural. Food is going to naturally have you response, have you salivate, have you your glands begin to work. Before conditioning takes place, if I were to ring a bell in front of a dog, the dog would probably not respond. The bell is the neutral stimulus. No response takes place. However, what he noticed was during the learning process, they would ring a bell and present it with food. Pretty soon the food would cause the response to take place, the unconditioned response. If you do that enough times, just ringing the bell, which now becomes the conditioned stimulus, would cause you to respond. Anytime you see conditioned, you're going to understand learned. Anytime you see unconditioned, you're going to think unlearned. So classical conditioning is when one learns to link two or more stimuli together. So let's get some of this vocabulary down. Unconditioned stimulus would be something that's unlearned. It causes a response in the absence of learning. It causes a natural response. So in our example here, it would be the food. Food is something that's going to naturally cause you to respond. You then have the unconditioned response, or the natural response. It's an unlearned reflex. It naturally happens. No training has occurred to produce it. It's often known as the UCR, unconditioned response, the natural response. In this case, it would be the dog salivating. You add a neutral stimulus to an unconditioned stimulus. The neutral stimulus would be the bell. It doesn't cause any reaction. Okay, to the conditioned stimulus would be the food, and you're going to get a response. So the bell with the food. Pretty soon, you're going to pair them enough times. The neutral stimulus will become the conditioned stimulus, a stimulus that's been associated with the natural response. In this case, it would be the bell. It's now a learned stimulus. Every time the dog hears a bell, it's going to salivate. It now becomes the conditioned response, which would be salivation. It's a learned response to a conditioned stimulus that is not natural. It's the trained response. So once again, I would make sure you have this diagram in your notes and maybe some examples of the different types of UCS, UCR, CS, CR. Let's take a look at an application problem. You might want to freeze it and put it in your notes and make sure you understand the different elements. Here's our example. A baby goes to the doctor and receives a shot and begins to cry. Okay, I always stop there. And I think, what is going to be the UCS? What is going to be the UCR? Things that are unlearned. Then you have the CS and the CR, which are the learned things. Okay, so a baby goes to the doctor and receives a shot and begins to cry. Always look for the reaction first, in the first part. Things that naturally happen. The UCR then would be the baby beginning to cry. It's the reaction. What naturally causes him to cry? Okay, well, what's going to cause you to cry is the needle and the pain that you're experiencing. He now is pairing that with something else. Now, every time the baby goes to the doctor, his coat or the room, he begins to cry. He sees the doctor's coat. He's in a room, the doctor's room. Okay. Always go to the reaction. The reaction is going to be cry. And then the CS now is maybe the doctor, the coat, the room. It's all going to cause you to cry. Here's some additional vocabulary you do need to know with this unit. The words are acquisition, first order and second order conditioning, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination. Acquisition is the first time that the conditioning takes place. It's the initial stage of learning where the neutral stimulus, which would be the bell, is getting paired with the response. Usually the condition or the neutral stimulus happens before the unconditioned stimulus. So usually, kind of what we talked about, conditioning is often used as a survival instinct. For example, to a deer in a forest, snapping of a twig, the conditioned stimulus, the twig snapping, may signal that something is approaching, a predator's approach, the unconditioned stimulus. Conditioning can help animals survive, gain food, avoid danger, locate mates, and produce offspring. The next thing you should know is first order and second order conditioning. Okay, first order conditioning is the first thing that usually gets conditioned. Okay, so in our case, it would be that the bell gets conditioned first. The bell gets conditioned with the food. It's going to cause you to react, salivate. Okay. Second order conditioning would be when additional things, additionally to the bell, gets conditioned. In this case, it could also be the lights on the element here. Lights are then going to trigger a response as well. Usually it is a weaker response. It's going to cause one to salivate. Okay, extinction. Extinction is the diminishing of a conditioned response. So after you stop pairing the bell and the food together, it's going to have the dog not respond anymore. Occurs in classical conditioning when an unconditioned stimulus, the UCS, does not follow conditioned stimulus, CS, so there's no more response. If one stops using the food with the bell, then the salivation is going to stop when it hears the bell. Spontaneous recovery, however, happens spontaneously after extinction has taken place. What they found out is sometimes you do spontaneously respond to bells even though the pairing is no longer taking place. Sometimes after extinction, the CR still randomly appears after the CS is present. You hear a bell after the extinction of the pair and the dog salivates. Generalization and discrimination. Generalization is the tendency, once a response has been conditioned, for the stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus to elicit a response. It's so similar. The different tones are very similar, so it's going to elicit a response. Something is so similar to the CS that you get a response. The different tones, the doctor looks very similar. Okay, response to any bells. Discrimination is when you're able to distinguish the difference between two different types of bells, so it's not going to elicit a response. Okay, something so different to the CS, so you don't get a CR. So here, this presentation, to recap, make sure you know learning, what associations are, classical conditioning and Pavlov, and then the additional vocabulary terms: acquisition, first order and second order conditioning, extinction, generalization, and discrimination, and spontaneous recovery.